Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Taylor, and I am a PGY1 pharmacy resident at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. And today I wanted to present to you all on Kratom. The title of this presentation is Kratom, an herbal supplement of atomic concern. We're not exactly sure, and I hope the presentation today will help address that. My advisor in this presentation was Bobby Pecco, and he is a PGY1 pharmacy practice coordinator at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Bobby and I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest to disclose regarding this subject matter of Kratom. Some of my objectives today are to review the history, pharmacology, off-label indications, and side effect profile of Kratom, to distinguish current federal and state legislation regarding Kratom, and question how it relates to its current use. And then lastly, we'll discuss historical strategies for the management of Kratom intoxication and outline that in a couple of patient cases. The objectives also apply to technicians. We'll review the mechanism, off-label uses, and side effects, and distinguish those laws and help them understand how exactly we would like to treat patients who come in with Kratom intoxication. So first we'll get into the background on Kratom. So there's a YouTube video link that I posted below here to Joe Rogan podcast. He is one of the more popular podcasts across all iTunes, Spotify podcast accounts, and he discusses the use of Kratom with another person named Hamilton Morris, and it does have a little bit of explicit content in it, but I figured it would be a relevant search for anybody who's interested in kind of gleaning exactly how Kratom is discussed in the media and how it's perceived. Vice is a cable news network that actually follows Kratom fairly closely, and they seem to think that it might be a gas station drug that could potentially end the opioid crisis. Just a couple of readings that maybe you could try and consider pursuing on the side if you wanted to look at how the social media perceives things. So on to our first patient case. We have, imagine that you are an EMS responder and you receive a call of an unresponsive woman that was found down on the boardwalk of Navy Pier. She's been down for approximately 15 minutes. She doesn't respond to any sternal rubs and has minimal respiratory drive. A bystander hands you a brownish green powder that comes from a baggie. What would your next steps be? The second patient case is PB. His chief complaint when he comes into the ED is that he wants to stay clean, and are you going to help him? He is a homeless male who presented with complaints of withdrawal symptoms. He's irritable, agitated, anxious, he's sweating, and he's also has diarrhea. He has a past medical history of heroin abuse for 2 years. He actually stopped using heroin in January 2018. His current medications are Tylenol, PRN, and Kratom scheduled 2 grams 3 times daily. And I also provided a urine tox screen when he presented to the ED. Noteworthy, it's negative for opioids. So on to Kratom. What exactly is this product that is being discussed in the media? So it's a tree that's native to Southeast Asia. It's a part of the Rubiaceae family, which is a derivative from the coffee plants, actually. Some of its street names are, as mentioned there, I'm going to try not to butcher these, but Biakdak, Ketum, Kehum, Itham, and Thom. It's originally found in Southeast Asia in countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Indonesia. Its leaves had historically been used in those countries for both recreational and medicinal purposes. Their consumption is usually by ingestion of raw leaves, but sometimes the leaves can be crushed and either smoked, brewed with a tea, or eventually packed and condensed into powder that can be ingested as capsules. So in Southeast Asia, enhancement of mood and well-being were a couple of the primary indications for it historically, as well as workers in Southeast Asia used it as a means of getting themselves through the workday. So they would ingest raw leaves as a mild stimulant to help them be more productive and get through their workdays. And a newer indication that developed in the late 20th century was for heroin addiction, it was a less costly alternative that had similar, achievement of side effects and euphoria that patients are looking for when they're addicted to heroin. So we discussed the background exactly of how it was used in Southeast Asia, but we haven't really talked about how it grew into Western civilization. So I conducted a PubMed search just for the word kratom and did a trend of how many publications there were year by year, starting from, looks like 1950 all the way up until 2018. And we had under 5 articles pretty much all the way until the 2006 range, and then we started to get into the double-digit range. And then just this past year, we had 46 articles in 2018 that described some content and discussion of kratom. So the topic has become much more prevalent and worthwhile in exactly how we want to manage these patients and what exactly we're trying to do when we encounter them potentially in the hospital. So this slide is a summary of the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report from the Centers of the CDC from 2010 to 2015, and it discussed how many exposures that had been throughout the United States during that period of time. And over that 5-year span, there were 660 reported calls into the poison control centers across the country. As you can see from the graph, there was a significant increase year by year with an apex in 2015. And in the overall distribution of the severity of the exposures, we can see here that we've got the majority of exposures in poison centers that were phone calls were in the moderate range, which were non-life-threatening, but they did require some form of treatment. So if there is some sort of pharmacological intervention or medical intervention that needs to be made, it's probably best that pharmacists and physicians are aware exactly of how we want to medically manage these patients. All right. And on this slide, we also have the summary fresh, hot off the press from 2017. These dropped on January 1st, but this is the human exposures to drugs of abuse from the National Poison Center's data system. And I listed 5 of the most commonly abused drugs. In the part I want to bring your attention to at least is the percentage increase per year of use of certain medications. So synthetic opioids like fentanyl, obviously, you're still seeing this outrageous spike in use each year. But kratom actually has had the second most in terms of percentage increase in the past year at 63.3%. These other ones mentioned as well were statistically significant, including the opioids, kratom, and heroin. Similarly here, I just wanted to present a 10-year trend of some of the drugs of abuse. So I listed heroin, methamphetamines, and cocaine. So on these 10-year trends, you can see of the number of reported calls and cases that the Poison Center had to deal with over that 10-year period. So heroin has seen a very steady increase, as has methamphetamines. Cocaine seems a little bit more sporadic in its presentation over the last decade. But next, kratom is on the next slide, and we can see its spike is pretty profound. It just shoots up from 2017 and 2018. And at the bottom of this slide, I've created a table of the demographic profile of single substance exposures of kratom that the National Poison Center data system had collected. They had 372 case mentions last year. Of those case mentions, I thought what was noteworthy on this slide was that there were 210 of them that were less than 20 years old. So we have teenagers and potentially children that are using this product maliciously, or enough so where they're having to call a poison control center to figure out how to manage these patients. Of note also, we had talked about in the Morbidity and Mortality CDC data about moderate requiring some form of pharmacological or maybe medical intervention, and that similarly these patients from 2017 also presented in that majority range where pharmacists might be needed to provide some form of intervention for these patients. So that was all of our national data. I figured I wanted to get something locally also, so I reached out to the Illinois Poison Control Center to try and collect some of our data, and I had exchanged a few emails with Carol Deloriers, who is one of the top people in the Illinois Poison Center, who provided me with the annual data from cases managed in the state of Illinois. And just last year, we received 18 cases alone. So there is some local connection where we actually are managing these patients, and it might be a little bit more relevant for us to understand what to do for these patients. So we discussed some background. Let's get into the nitty-gritty stuff that we like in the pharmacology. So kratom leaves contain over 25 alkaloids, but I've only listed 5 of the most common ones here. The major ones that we'll be discussing today are metragenine and 7-hydroxymetragenine. Those 2 are the ones that create the active components, or likely create the active components of kratom. Metragenine comprises about 66%, and 7-hydroxymetragenine only about 2%. It's structurally similar to yohimbine, which maybe nobody's heard of, but it's a dietary supplement that's also used for sexual drive, which is one of the other indications that people may have been using it for in Southeast Asia. Specifically now, when we get into the mechanism of action of some of these metabolites, metragenine, like I said, was the most common one. It has activity on mu, delta, and kappa receptors. There's a lot of conflicting data as to exactly if they are agonists, partial agonists, or antagonists on those receptors. But some of the more recent publications from 2016 and 2017 talk about that metragenine and 7-hydroxymetragenine are actually partial agonists on the mu opioid receptors, likely because of this biased receptor selectivity that happens. Their metragenine and 7-hydroxymetragenine work towards the G protein coupled receptors, but they are biased in that they don't. Beta-arrestin is also not involved in the biochemical pathway. And in a standard opioid, say morphine or a fentanyl, beta-arrestin and G protein coupled receptors are used, and with their concomitant activity, there's more selectivity for those mu opioid receptors. So it's postulated that having metragenine and 7-hydroxymetragenine create only that partial agonistic effect, which also plays an impact in the drug's chemical structure is a little bit different than a morphine derivative. So it's thought that there's less side effects that come from that. So less respiratory depression that you normally see with opioids. There's also less of that sedative effect and the negative adverse events that you'd expect to see from high doses of opioids. The other mechanisms in metragenine, though, that we want to go over are the postsynaptic alpha-2 adrenergic agonism, kind of in that mechanism of action similar to maybe what quantity might do. And then a 5-HT2A receptor antagonist is one of the other primary mechanisms built around metragenine. And then 7-hydroxymetragenine, although it comprises only about 2% of the pharmacologically active component of kratom, it's extremely potent, and the 13 to 46-fold higher potency is kind of this number that got thrown around a lot in the literature, and I kept trying to trace it backwards to find exactly where it started, and there wasn't a lot of evidence from like a PK study or anything that told you it was more potent. But it was something that I figured I would cite in here just because historically it was talked about so frequently. And then lastly, these other 3 metabolites, speciosilentine is an anticholinergic, and then the other 2 are antimuscarinic agents in the GI tract. So let's just take a second here. I kind of already slipped and gave one away though, but what drugs or drug classes does kratom most likely resemble? So you can take a moment to kind of like ponder that. I know it's really high level stuff, but I figured I would give this an opportunity for everybody to think about it. So does anybody want to mention maybe what the 5-HT2A receptor antagonist might resemble? It's a doozy, I know. It's an antipsychotic. You got it, Abby. So next we'll get into the PK exactly with Kratom. So there was one study that was conducted in 10 healthy Malaysian individuals who were chronic users of Kratom. And this was the distribution exactly of all of the data that was collected on them. So if we look at this here, we've got a pretty long half-life in this patient population of almost a day, but with a pretty high standard deviation. So there's very variable kinetics, but the drug has a really large volume of distribution, so it gets out of circulation. It has first-order kinetics, and the study also found that there was very, very minimal urine excretion of unchanged drug, which also gives us an indication that this drug is likely hepatically metabolized, and they also found it to be a strong CYP2D6 inhibitor. So the long half-life found in this study is kind of consistent with an indication maybe in opioid withdrawal, that it may be helpful for those patients who maybe are abusing heroin and they need some other form of opioid activity that could prevent them from abusing other substances. So next, there are some off-label indications for which people use Kratom. None of these, I just want to note, are of quality randomized controlled trials, and that they are subjective effects. So there's no high-quality evidence that describes exactly what happens for these people. But at low doses, the drug acts as a stimulant. Somewhere in that 1 to 5 gram range, people are experiencing what they might describe as like a cup of coffee, but it makes you feel a little bit better. You get that increased alertness. You'll have a little bit of a pleasant euphoria, maybe a decrease in inhibitions that maybe you'll talk to a girl or a guy that you just never expected you would, something like that. Give you a little bit of remove the stage fright that maybe you have in those situations. At higher doses with 5 to 15 grams, you'll start to see maybe this legal high or the chronic pain management that patients maybe are using and abusing Kratom for. So with this, patients might start to see a little bit more of the opioid-like side effects of analgesia, constipation, euphoria, and sedation. And then in those chronic users who are abusing greater than 15 grams either per dose or over the course of a day are likely to see potentially some of these adverse events that have been historically reported in case series or case reports regarding Kratom. So this study by Vignasingham and others surveyed a bunch of Malaysian patients and asked them exactly what they were using Kratom for and what exactly they thought the short-term and long-term effects would provide with the medication for them. So chronic users were those that had been using it for greater than 6 months. But the thing that's of note here is that in patients who were using the medication to help decrease addiction to other drugs and reduce withdrawal symptoms, a number of Malaysian individuals, more than about 80% average on both of them, say that they're using this medication for that purpose. And then for the perceived benefits, kind of as we discussed earlier, some of them are working harder as a result of taking it. It increases their sex desire. It might make them hungrier, and it might reduce their heroin and withdrawal symptoms as well. So that describes the survey in Malaysia, but I wanted to apply it also to Western civilization. So I found a survey of 500 individuals who were in 12-step programs, and they surveyed these 500 patients with a series of questions about their demographics, their background use, how they used Kratom. And some of the noteworthy findings were that about 1 in 5 patients were lifetime users of Kratom, but that almost 3/4 of them were using it as a means of reducing heroin abuse. About 1 in 5 were using it for a disability or chronic pain. None of this prospective survey data told us anything about if the medication is well studied and safe in these patients at all. This is merely just observational and collecting information about the Western civilization. But besides Smith and others, I had actually found another survey from the American Kratom Association. They had conducted an anonymous cross-sectional online survey of 10,000 individual users, and they ended up finding of the 8,000 that completed the survey, same thing, about 68% were self-treating for pain, and then they had 66% that were using it for an emotional or mental condition. But then they also had asked a question to the surveyors if they thought that the use of Kratom required medical advice or an opportunity to seek mental health assistance, and 99.2% said no, that they did not. So subjectively, these patients feel as if they're okay on this medication and that they don't need the advice of medical expertise. So we talked about how the drug might have some habit-forming properties based on its mechanism of action. So here are some of the physical and psychological withdrawal symptoms of Kratom. So they look pretty similar to what you might, what a heroin addict might be feeling if they were withdrawing as well. You have the irritability, you have muscular pain and cramps, you could have diarrhea and sweating, and then some of those psychological symptoms like hallucinations or intense cravings, aggression, sadness, or nervousness. So it is really of note that these are similar symptoms to opioid withdrawals that these patients are experiencing. There was one case report that actually outlined the timeline of withdrawal symptoms that they were experiencing. There wasn't really a clinical guideline that told you at day 3 you would experience this, at day 2 you'd see this. But I outlined a timeline here from that case report that talked about initially in this person who'd been abusing Kratom for multiple years, stopped cold turkey in an inpatient setting, and they experienced a mild diaphoresis initially, but then in days 1 and 2, the true withdrawal symptoms begun, and they needed to intervene with clonidine as one of the treatments for their withdrawals, which ended up working in this case report, which we will discuss a little bit later. This also is some information that I obtained from a website that talks about strains of Kratom. So like this also, these are subjective side effects of certain strains of Kratom. So we have a red vein, white vein, and green vein. From my understanding of the readings, red vein is the most commonly purchased one that has the most similar side effect profile to maybe what the euphoria of an opioid would have on patients, and that it prevents withdrawal symptoms. The white vein is known as more of the coffee mimetic, and then the green vein is considered the energy booster, but also creates subtle effects on the pain. So it creates a delicate balance for both patients. So kind of the punchline here, if we reflect back on our case of PD, who was the heroin addict who was taking Kratom and had nothing on his urine analysis. Kratom is undetectable in a urine drug screen. There are methods of detecting it in the bloodstream and in the urine, but they are specific for the 7-hydroxymetragenine or the metragenine metabolites. So they have to be done through some major organic chemistry nerd stuff that I don't understand, but high-performance liquid chromatography or a linear ion trap mass spec. So when I was thinking about all this too, I kind of wanted to try and make this a little bit more practical to exactly like how I would go about getting Kratom potentially, since it's so publicly available. In Chicago here, at least where I'm presenting, there are stores called CBD Kratom, and they're located in Chicago, St. Louis, Dallas, Los Angeles. I figured I'd just pop in there and like just buy some and see what it's like. So you can buy 10 grams of the powder, which if you remember 10 grams was like a mild opioid-like side effect profile, and it's $9.95. 10 capsules, about 1 gram is what they estimate is in each one, $7.95. So these people who purchase this product could potentially spend very minimal amounts of money and get a lot of medication to use, however they so chose. But I took a few pictures exactly of like the brick and mortar establishment and some of the strains that they have. Red Bali, obviously one of those red, green Malay, and then I don't remember what this one was, white Muang Da or something. But I took a picture inside also, and this is the kind of setup they have at the counter where you can purchase everything. I mean, they've got an abundance of strains, and I was asking one of the gentlemen who was helping me about kind of the side effect profiles of each, and it seemed very subjective where he was describing coffee mimetic side effects with the green strain and more of the pain relief with the red strain, but he said it totally varied from strain to strain, and he could physically describe different experiences from each one that he remembers. But if you look really closely up there at the top, the prices, you can get up to like about a kilogram for under $1,000. So you can get a really high amount in purchasing at these stores. So something of note that the general population can just walk in and buy it, and they don't ask for a driver's license. They should, because you have to be 18 or older in the state of Illinois, which we'll get into in a little bit. But these are available in multiple locations across the country. So we'll get on to our first assessment question for all the pharmacists in the room. Which of the following is not a pharmacological action of metragine, which was the very first alkaloid? So is it A, a 5-HT2A receptor antagonist? Is it an anticholinergic? Is it a postsynaptic alpha-2 adrenergic agonist? Or activity on mu, delta, and kappa receptors? B. Great job. Right, that was for a different alkaloid, not metragine. We don't have any technicians in here, but maybe we can all try and answer this one and see if we can put our brains together. So, for what off-label indication was PD using Kratom? Heroin addiction. Good call. So then also another tech question. I figured this one would be good, but you're working as a tech on the 9th floor pharmacy. A nurse called you asking about drugs that can be detected on our standard urine tox screen. Which of the following drugs is not detectable? C. Great job. So next we're going to get into the legislation and how it applies exactly to the state of Illinois and what's been going on in the last 5 or 6 years. So this very busy slide describes a federal timeline exactly of what's been happening. So initially in August of 2016, the DEA, I guess I'll backtrack first. 2008, the drug was considered an emerging drug of abuse. So the DEA and the FDA kind of put it on their radar as something that they wanted to monitor. So come August 2016, they decided to place an emergency Schedule 1 on Kratom. For any drug that's ever placed as an emergency Schedule 1, it has to be deemed an imminent hazard to public safety. Right after that happened in the months of September and early October, there was tremendous bipartisan pushback from members of Congress. There were numbers of letters that overflowed the DEA and the FDA where they actually took a step back and reassessed that there was no imminent hazard to public safety, and they withdrew their Schedule 1. And they requested, the DEA requested that the FDA conduct an expedited review of the medication. That obviously is still ongoing. So in November of 2016 as well, the Penny Associates developed an 8-factor analysis. So for those who aren't aware, an 8-factor analysis is a legal framework that industry members who are creating a new drug will guide, it'll help guide their path of their drug as it's on its way to approval in terms of its abuse activity and how exactly it could be concerning to schedule the drug, whether to place it as Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So the Penny Associates were hired as a consultant for the American Kratom Association to conduct this 8-factor analysis. Of note also, right after that, in October of 2017, the Department of Health and Human Services sent a letter to the DEA that was their own version of an 8-factor analysis that placed their stance on why they think this is a drug of abuse. That the HHS letter actually, it was dated from October of 2017, but it actually only reached the press in November of last year, 2018. But it describes pretty much the framework behind which the FDA is looking to schedule Kratom. It has some decent information in there about all previous studies and safety profiles and toxicity reports that have been collected over the years in the literature. So besides the HHS letter to the DEA, Scott Gottlieb, the FDA commissioner, has made multiple statements through 2018. Initially in February, he highlighted the 36 deaths that had happened in the United States, not necessarily as a direct result of Kratom, but patients who had overdosed on multiple medications, and Kratom was also found in their urine and or bloodstream. So he wanted to voice his concerns about this medication and that there should be more regulation coming around the medication. Similarly, in November, they had conducted field investigations and they collected specimens from multiple Kratom stores, and they found concentrations of nickel and copper, I believe, that were found in several of the components of the Kratom products. So it was more of a point of emphasis that these medications, or the Kratom, when it's compounded, you can't exactly guarantee that it's done in good manufacturing practices that the FDA tries to outline. So initially, after Scott Gottlieb has made these statements, the American Kratom Association also responds with their own counter move of supporting literature about how it's safe and healthy in these individuals. But then lastly, last month, the National Institute of Drug Abuse awarded a $3.5 million grant to the University of Florida to conduct more thorough research into the alkaloid components of Kratom, specifically metragenine and 7-hydroxymetragenine. So another brainstorming session, I kind of wanted everybody to take a second and think about it here, but I wanted everybody to discuss the DEA's decision to schedule and withdraw their scheduling of Kratom within the 30 days. Would you describe that as a good decision on their part or a bad decision based on the information that was provided to you? So discuss with your partner for a second maybe if you feel like it, or just kind of sit in silence.
I know.
It's supposed to be a gift, but it won't move.
Either way.
That's a good question. I think a good decision for the public is how I perceive this one. But maybe if you thought the DEA made a bad decision to schedule it in the first place. I'm not sure exactly. No, I'm not making a stance on that now. I think that their conclusion was a little erratic, and it was not well thought out before they made a conclusion exactly on what to do with it. So, as I kind of discussed in that federal legislation timeline, we also have this eight-factor analysis that the Pinney Associates and the DEA, or I guess the Health and Human Services, conducted on Kratom. So these are the 8 components of an eight-factor analysis that you can kind of read over and understand exactly. But the ones really where the FDA and the federal government kind of have their fallacy in their argument and the house of cards kind of fall down is what, if any, risk there is to public health, and then whether the substance is an immediate precursor of a substance that's already controlled. Since its chemical component is so structurally different from opioids and morphine derivatives, they don't really have anything to go off of. It looks exactly like this drug, so we have to regulate it. So right now, we're still in that holding pattern where I guess that $3.5 million to the University of Florida is really the bulk of our United States research that's going to be conducted in the next year or so, for now. So that was the federal legislation timeline, so let's try and apply it now to the state of Illinois. I obtained this map from speciosa.org, which is a common, I guess, public access website for Kratom users to kind of talk about their experiences. It's sponsored by the American Kratom Association and the BEA, the Botanical Educational Alliance, I think. I can't remember what the acronym is. But if we look here at the state of Illinois, we're orange, which means we have pending legislation. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But of note, you can see there's a lot more green on this map than any other color, which would mean that Kratom is unregulated in these states and open and available for purchase for anybody, potentially even minors. You can go into gas stations and buy this. You don't necessarily have to go to the brick and mortars that I went to here in Chicago. So red is obviously illegal. The yellows they had amendments in their legislations, maybe that places regulations on age or restrictions to purchase, perhaps manufacturing requirements. And then lastly, the purple ones are, the blue ones are failed legislation, but the drug is still legal.
What's the purple?
I actually didn't write it down, and I regret that I didn't. I can't remember now exactly what Louisiana and Oregon had. I'll have to get back to you on that one. So now applying that to the state of Illinois. So we had House Bill 5526 that came across in August of 2014 that created the Illinois Kratom Control Act. So the Illinois Kratom Control Act was essentially a component that placed restrictions. No persons under the age of 18 could purchase, possess, yada, yada, yada for the product. And if they were ever found in possession, it's a violation of a Class B as in boy misdemeanor. Remember that one. And that it's a minimum fine of $500. And those are the two big takeaways that I want you to get from that one. And then in November of 2017, we had House Bill 4106. Representative Katie Stewart introduced this one to Congress here in the state of Illinois, and it was an amendment that was filed to the Kratom Control Act, which was trying to change the age of the persons from under 18 to all individuals. So essentially making the drug illegal to possess, purchase, or use. But that was when it was introduced in November of 2017. Shortly thereafter, it was put in the Rules Committee. I continued to follow it through when I started making these slides in December, and it had sat in the Rules Committee. I know that here in January 2019, we made recent change in Congress, and I think now the bill is currently still in a holding pattern, and I'm not exactly sure what the next steps are, but hopefully there will be more discussion about the use of the medication and the House bill, exactly how it will be going forward. So let's flex our Jimmy Neutron boy genius brains here and do the think brain blast and come up with your stance on the legality of Kratom. So I'm going to try and bring the group back together. Does anybody kind of want to make a comment on how they would make a stance on this, legal versus illegal? Any brave?
We talked about saying that we would make it illegal, just due to the fact that you talked about the number of cases that have been seen within 2017, 2018. Yes, they weren't severe, but at the same time, they required medical treatment. So at that point, what benefit is it providing to the general public that is not regulated? You talked about the amount of grams that you can see between the two, and there's some sort of money that's being profited through this. So you've got multiple sources that could, at any point, not be regulated and therefore cause harm to patients and the ability for them to utilize it. Whereas the benefit you talked about is for opioid withdrawal or stimulation, where both of those should be regulated processes. So therefore, by making it illegal, it forces them to continue to utilize this money instead of using it as a government fund towards a bill to try to move towards trials, and instead of national funding, use the American Kratom Association funding to actually try to get this passed the proper way.
But you do think that further research is warranted, though?
Correct, but it should not be on the National Institutes of Health to do that.
Correct.
It should be something that's done by the company. This is how drugs work. You have a molecule, you develop its process, you make it, therefore it goes to testing. Phase 1 trials moving forward.
But would you say like a class 1 illegal, or would you like put a different schedule on it? Because if it's class 1, it's much harder to study.
I would class 1 right now, and then from the molecule, like you can use the molecule to therefore actually produce something that's needed.
Right.
But at the same time, you're going to put something that's likely going to have multiple mechanisms, therefore more adverse effects. If you have something that's actually going to work, then why don't you actually break it down to what molecule is going to provide the most benefit?
Great points by both of you. Thank you for your contribution. Next, on to an assessment question. So, which of the following statements is false regarding the federal timeline? So they're kind of busy statements, but we had the expedited review and the scheduling recommendation. We had the $3.5 million grant, and then we had that it was placed as a Schedule 2 to avoid imminent hazard to public safety, and that Scott Gottlieb made repeated statements. Great job. Schedule 1, right? Next, for technicians, which of the following best describes the current legal status of the Kratom Control Act in the state of Illinois? I think I heard an all of the above. I'm going with it. Good call. So now we're going to get into the toxicity management of Kratom. So I described those 36 reported cases in the United States that Scott Gottlieb talked about and how exactly those patients were overdosing. So the largest case series that I could find that described patients overdosing and fatalities associated with Kratom are those that were taking this combination called Kratom, which is Kratom with O-desmethyltramadol, the active metabolite in one of the active metabolites in tramadol. And they had 9 fatalities that were found in Sweden from 2009 to 2011. Both specimens, metragenine and 7-hydroxymetragenine, were detected in the urine and the blood. Most of the patients, I believe, if I'm recalling, were dying from a form of pulmonary congestion and edema, secondary, and then there was a litany of other things that were happening to them, but I think that was the primary cause of death in most of them. So this is our kind of our go-to table for how we want to medically manage these patients in terms of their adverse side effect profiles of Kratom and how maybe they're either misusing or abusing it and how they would be treated exactly if you presented to the hospital. Most of these are all case reports of how they manage these patients. I think they're all pretty self-explanatory. The only one that I think that were unique cases, there was an intrahepatic cholestasis patient who had begun Kratom over a 2-week period, no other changes in their medication or diet regimens, and developed an acute liver failure and discontinued the medication, and there was symptom resolution. That was one of the very unique cases. But for the withdrawal and addiction, I think is going to be the most frequent encounter that we would see in the EDs or on the inpatient side. Most patients I read historically, were either treated with an induction of buprenorphine, naloxone, or this clonidine hydroxyzine combination that I talked about in the case report previously. The other thing I think of note on this slide that I'd like to bring up for patients who are presenting maybe that they were found down, like our first patient over on Navy Pier. If we don't know exactly what had happened to this patient and we can conclude that that baggie may have had Kratom in it, there is a competitive activity for naloxone taking over and working as a reversal agent against Kratom, potentially in an overdose situation. So we'll bring it back together here on the case presentation. So we had talked about PB as that 18-year-old homeless male, and here's some more objective findings. He is hypertensive and tachycardic. He's diaphoretic and sweating, so he must be really sweaty. That's a nice typo by Taylor right there. And then he also has yellowing of the skin, eyes, and some right upper quadrant pain, and he's got some transaminitis and an elevated T-billy. He admitted to taking Kratom for 11 months, and then recently lost his job selling CDs on Michigan Avenue, and he has no other way to purchase his Kratom. But the medical intern is unsure of exactly how he wants to treat this patient, so he's going to ask you for your recommendation. So based on the presentation, which regimen would you recommend? Which one do you think is most correct? He was tacky. Yeah, that was kind of my one little thing.
I don't know if the treatment side of tachycardia was so.
I'm probably not going to.
So I would not do both, actually.
You wouldn't?
No. If he's withdrawing, so you don't need to treat with both.
with more quantity, you're saying, essentially? Lastly, for our technicians, if a patient was to come in unconscious and not breathing, what would be the best medication to administer to reverse the symptoms of a kratom overdose? Great job. So kind of as a conclusion point, I think that kratom is an interesting medication. I think it has a unique pharmacological profile. But before I could ever recommend it to the general public, I think that there is a lot more investigation into the pharmacological profiles, the side effects. We need high-quality randomized controlled trials. There needs to be a better development of evidence before I could make a recommendation to allow this medication to be publicly accessible and used. So as of right now, I wouldn't feel comfortable recommending a friend to go get the medication. But I hope you all enjoyed the brief snippet of information about kratom. What questions do you guys have? Dan?
So on one of the last slides, you kind of mentioned that lipid rescue might be indicated in like severe, like if they're having severe cardiopulmonary symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find any dosing or any sort of recommendations for that based on like how lipophilic it is? Or?
There was only one case report of it, and I think they followed like a standard lipid guideline. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but if you just search lipids and kratom in PubMed, it'll come up as that one case report, and you can see what they did. The patient didn't end up surviving in that one, though. So, I mean, take it for what it is, but you could consider doing their dosing regimen or coming up with an alternative on your own.
Part of the assessment of, whether or not you spend all this money and develop these drugs, like that there's some new benefit to this versus what's already, available and, has been studied. So, I mean, what benefit is this compound compared to, versus just something that's trendy that you get it in the corner and it's easy?
Great question. Going back of the drug, I didn't mention it on the slide exactly, but we have this non-Morphonian component metragenine is described as. So as a partial agonist, this unique claim to fame that you might describe of the drug is that it's this G protein coupled receptor activity, but it doesn't have the beta-arrestin activity. So there is a bias selectivity for the opioid receptors. Because of that partial agonism, it's postulated that there's less respiratory depression, there's less of the GI side effects, and that is supposed to create a unique component of kratom that users might have less of an addictive property to kratom, but it would still be used to prevent addiction. So my best conclusion on that would be that...
Sounds like buprenorphine.
Yeah. Is that a different mechanism? Because I haven't gone back and actually broken down to like the partial agonist portion. So it is a different mechanism than buprenorphine.
I didn't look at buprenorphines exactly to tell you that it's identical spitting image or if it has differences, but it is a good point. It is similar to buprenorphine. So.